There is a moment somewhere between the first war and the last one when a species decides what it is. Not what it tells itself it is. Not what it writes in its history books or carves into its monuments. What it actually is, down in the marrow, in the dark, when the enemy is bigger and the math doesn't work and the smart thing to do is surrender. Every civilization in the known galaxy had faced that moment. The Veth had surrendered. The Oran Collective had negotiated. The Solhari had simply ceased to exist, quietly, like a candle going out in a room nobody was watching. Then there was Earth. Nobody had asked humanity what it was. Nobody had thought to. They were small. They were new. They lived on one unremarkable wet rock circling one ordinary star, and they had only just figured out how to leave their own solar system when the hegemony fleet entered their space with 1,700 warships, and a single diplomatic message that translated, roughly, to, "You have 72 of your hours to begin the process of peaceful absorption, or we will begin the process of less peaceful absorption." The hegemony had done this 412 times. 412 civilizations. 412 messages. 412 absorptions. They were very good at it. What they were not, what they had never needed to be, in 412 attempts, was ready for the answer they received from humanity's newly appointed defense secretary, a former coal miner from West Virginia named Harold Briggs, who had apparently been chosen for the job because he was the only person in the building who hadn't fainted when the alien fleet showed up on the radar. Harold's response, transmitted on all frequencies in every language the translation matrix could handle, was 11 words. "You picked the wrong species, friend. Buckle up. We remember everything." Asterisk the hegemony's Fleet Admiral Sarvel, a being who had personally overseen 63 planetary absorptions without incident, read the message twice. Then, she asked her intelligence officer what buckle up meant. The intelligence officer did not know. Within 6 hours, she would understand it perfectly. Within 6 days, she would never forget it. Within 6 weeks, her civilization would be having a very serious conversation about whether they had made, perhaps, a small miscalculation. This is that story. It starts with rocks. The first thing Fleet Admiral Sarvel noticed about the humans was that they were calm. That was wrong. That was deeply, fundamentally wrong in a way that her 40 years of fleet command had not prepared her for. Every other civilization she had ever approached had responded to 1,700 warships entering their space with a very predictable sequence of events. First, the long silence, communications blackout, while the ruling body panicked in a room somewhere. Then, the frantic counter-broadcasts, half-finished sentences, and overlapping voices, the sound of bureaucracies discovering their own fear in real time. Then, eventually, the formal response. Measured, diplomatic, terrified underneath the formality like a fire underneath carpet. She knew the pattern. She had watched it 412 times. Fear was universal. Fear was the great equalizer of the cosmos. Even the Solhari, who had been 3 times humanity's size and twice their technological development, had gone through the same sequence. Silence, panic, formality, surrender. The humans skipped all of it. 11 minutes after her fleet dropped out of transit space, and her communications array pinged the planet below with the standard hegemony absorption notice, she received a response. One response. No overlapping voices, no committee language, no diplomatic hedging. A single human male, mid-50s by her intelligence files on human aging, sitting in what appeared to be a very ordinary office with a cup of something hot, and a flag behind him that had too many stars on it. "This is Harold Briggs," the human said, and he sounded like someone who had just been interrupted during lunch. "Defense Secretary, Earth Unified Government. I'm going to need you to hold on a minute." He looked off camera. There was a muffled conversation. Someone handed him a piece of paper. He read it. He made a face like the paper had personally offended him. "Okay," Harold said. "I've been briefed. 1,700 ships. You want us to surrender peacefully and join your," he looked at the paper again, "hegemony, or you'll start shooting." "That's the situation," Saravel, through her translator, confirmed that was broadly, The situation, yes. Harold nodded slowly. He took a sip of his drink. He set it down. Yeah, he said. No. Then came the 11 words. Then came a transmission cut. Saravel sat in her command chair for 4 full seconds without moving, which was, for her species, the equivalent of standing with your mouth open. Her second-in-command, Sub-Admiral Yeth, leaned forward. Orders? Find out, Saravel said, what buckle up means. Harold Briggs had not, in fact, been calm. He had been catastrophically terrified and had spent the 45 minutes between the alien fleet's arrival and his broadcast sitting in a bathroom stall in the basement of the Defense Ministry, breathing the way his doctor had told him to breathe when his blood pressure got too high, which was slowly and through the nose. The breathing had not helped. What had helped, somewhat, was his granddaughter calling him on his personal comm to ask if the aliens were real, and if so, were they friendly. And Harold had said yes, they were real, and no, they were not friendly. And his granddaughter had said, cool, so you're going to fight them? And Harold had said yes, probably. And his granddaughter had said, obviously we're going to win though, right, Grandpa? And Harold had said yes, obviously. He had said it automatically, the way you say things to children. Then he had sat there for a moment thinking about the fact that he had just said it, had said obviously about a situation involving 1,700 alien warships, and had found, to his own considerable surprise, that he believed it. He had grown up in a county where the main industry was taking things out of the ground. Coal, mostly, but also iron, copper, the occasional vein of something that made geologists excited. His grandfather had worked the mines. His father had worked the mines. Harold had worked the mines for 11 years before a back injury, and a political science degree had redirected his life in a direction nobody, including Harold, had anticipated. He understood, in a way that was physical and not intellectual, that the ground was not empty, that there were things in the ground that could be made into other things, that a mountain was not just a mountain. He also understood, from 30 years of watching human governments navigate things that seemed impossible, that humans were constitutionally incapable of being told something was over. It was, in his assessment, both their greatest flaw and their only real trick. He came out of the bathroom. He went upstairs. He found the closest camera. He said what he said. Then he went back to his office and started making calls, because now he had to actually figure out what came next. And the clock on the wall said it had approximately 67 hours before the fleet admiral's deadline expired. The calls took 12 hours. That was not unusual. Getting humans to agree on anything took time, and getting every government on Earth to agree on a single military strategy under a 72-hour deadline was the kind of coordination challenge that would have paralyzed most species entirely. What saved it, what always saved it, in Harold's experience, was that humans had spent so long fighting each other that they had developed a very specific kind of genius for collaborative desperation. They were worst-case scenario thinkers. They were contingency planners. Every military on Earth for the past 500 years had been wargaming scenarios exactly like this one, quietly in basements, because they were humans, and imagining catastrophic threats and planning responses was simply what they did on Tuesday afternoons. The plan that emerged from the 12 hours was not one plan. It was 1,800 smaller plans, layered on top of each other, each one contingent on the ones below it, each one designed to be abandoned when it stopped working and replaced with the next one on the list. It was, from the outside, a mess. From the inside, it was the most human possible approach to an impossible situation. Assume you will lose the first thing, plan for the second thing, know the third thing by heart, and make sure someone has already thought of the thing that comes after that breaks too. The hegemony's intelligence files on humanity were extensive. They had been observing Earth for approximately 40 years, long enough to document human technology, human population, human political structures, and human military capability. The files were accurate. They showed a species that had nuclear weapons, approximately 12,000 of them distributed across 9 nations, as well as conventional naval and air forces, early-stage orbital defense platforms, and approximately 420 million active military personnel across all nations combined. By hegemony standards, This was a medium-grade pre-contact civilization, capable of destroying themselves several times over, incapable of threatening a fleet that could glass a continent from orbit without slowing down. The files did not mention rocks. This was an oversight that would later be studied in hegemony military academies for generations. The hegemony made its first move at hour 18, not hour 72. Saravel had not survived 40 years in the fleet by following schedules when early action was available. The humans had refused absorption. The protocol was clear. Begin with a demonstration. Targeted, clean, visible from the planet's surface. Not a populated area. A mountain range, usually, or a large empty body of water. Something that showed capability without triggering the kind of species-wide panic response that made absorption messy. She chose a mountain range in the northern part of the largest continent. High elevation, minimal human population, visually dramatic. She gave the order. 3 ships broke from a fleet in high orbit and adjusted their angles. The mountains, a moment later, ceased to exist. Or rather, they ceased to be mountains. They became a very large amount of very fast-moving debris ejected laterally from the point of impact, and the energy release lit up the night side of the planet like a second sun for approximately 4 seconds, and when it faded, there was a new geological feature on Earth that geologists would later estimate would take approximately 6 million years to become something unremarkable. Saravel watched the sensor readings. She waited for the communication spike, the panic, the reconsideration, the request to talk. What she got instead, 6 minutes later, was Harold Briggs again. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was accurate. He also looked like the kind of person who had made his peace with not sleeping, which was more interesting. "Hell of a light show," Harold said. "Nobody died. I'm guessing that was intentional." She confirmed, through her translator, that it was. "Okay," Harold said. "Then, I'm going to need you to understand something about us." He leaned slightly forward. "We have seen worse. A lot worse. We did a lot of it to ourselves. You want us scared, you're going to need to think bigger." A pause. "Also, and I mean this respectfully, you just handed us something we're going to use against you, and I wanted you to know that before it happens, because it seemed like the sporting thing to do." He cut the transmission. Saravel looked at Yeth. "What do we hand them?" Yeth was already at the sensor array. "The debris field," he said, slowly, "from the mountains." He looked up. "Admiral, they're calculating trajectories." "For what purpose?" Yeth's secondary eyes, the ones that only opened when he was genuinely alarmed, opened. "They're going to throw the mountains back at us," he said. The thing about rocks, Harold had explained to the Joint Chiefs 14 hours earlier, was that rocks were free. Kinetic impactors, the technical term for taking a large mass and accelerating it towards something you wanted destroyed, were not a new concept in human military theory. They had been in the books for over a century. The problem, always, had been the acceleration part. Getting a rock big enough to matter moving fast enough to hurt something required enormous energy, and Earth had never had a practical reason to develop that kind of energy because rocks did not need to threaten other rocks. The rocks were already there. Now, there was a reason. The mountains the hegemony had vaporized had become, courtesy of the hegemony's own weapons, a pre-fragmented debris cloud distributed across a very large volume of near-Earth space. Chunks ranging from fist-sized to small building-sized, already moving, already spread across vectors that made them difficult to target all at once. The rail systems that Earth's orbital platforms had been quietly retrofitting for the past 11 years, a project that had officially been described as cargo transfer infrastructure and had been considered deeply boring by everyone who had filed the budget reports, could interact with that debris. Not shoot it, not accelerate it to devastating speed. Just nudge it, redirect it, convert existing kinetic energy from random trajectories into not quite random ones. It was not a weapon. It was a conversation. The first piece of redirected mountain hit a hegemony frigate on the outer edge of the fleet at hour 21. The chunk was not large, approximately the size of a ground vehicle, and the frigate's point defense handled it. That was expected. That was the point. The second piece hit 3 minutes later. The third, 2 minutes after that. Then, for pieces simultaneously. Then 11. Point defense was good at handling one thing, two things, 10 things. Point defense was not designed to handle 437 simultaneous inbound contacts of varying size, mass, and vector distributed across a three-dimensional engagement volume, originating from a debris cloud that the fleet was already inside of. The frigate's point defense did not handle the 44th contact, or the 45th. On Saravel's command deck, alarms started going off. Not battle stations alarms, not the sounds of war, but the softer, more insulting alarm that meant your ships were being damaged by debris. And she stood up from her chair and looked at her sensor screens and understood with a clarity that was almost physically painful what Harold Briggs had meant. They had handed the humans ammunition. 400 years of absorptions. 400 years of demonstration strikes. Of mountains vaporized. Of shows of force. Not one of those 400 civilizations had picked up the pieces and thrown them back. Saravel looked at the sensor screens. She looked at the debris field. She looked at the readouts from 3 of her ships that were now showing structural damage from rocks. "Yes," she said. "Admiral, update the intelligence file on humanity." To say what? She was quiet for a moment. Start with, they remember everything. Outside, in the dark between the fleet and the planet, the mountains kept coming. Harold got the damage report at hour 22. He was eating a sandwich at his desk. His first food in 19 hours, a fact his aide had communicated to him with the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by Harold's relationship with basic biological necessities. When the orbital platform commander's face appeared on his screen with the preliminary numbers. 3 hegemony frigates with confirmed structural damage. 1 with partial drive failure. 0 human casualties. 0 human ships destroyed. Harold chewed. He swallowed. He looked at the numbers. "How long can we keep it up?" he asked. "Debris field gives us another 6 to 8 hours of useful material at current redirect rates," the commander said. "After that, we're into smaller stuff. Won't do much to their hull plating. And then we start phase 2. The commander paused. "Sir, they're going to figure out what we're doing. They're probably going to be angry about it." Harold nodded. He picked up the second half of his sandwich. "Good," he said. "Angry people make mistakes. Ask me how I know." The commander opened her mouth, closed it, decided that was probably not a question Harold actually wanted answered. On the screens behind Harold, the night sky over Earth was very quiet. The fleet was still there. 1,700 ships, slightly rearranged. One of them was dark on one side in a way it hadn't been before. Small thing. A scratch. But the scratch had come from a mountain. And Harold Briggs, who had grown up understanding that there were things in the ground that could be made into other things, was already thinking about what else was in the ground. The clock said 49 hours remained on the deadline. Harold thought that was probably more time than they needed. He finished his sandwich. The Hegemony War Council convened at hour 24. This was in itself unusual. War councils happened before campaigns, not during them. The absorption of pre-contact civilizations was not a campaign in the way that hegemony military doctrine understood campaigns. It was a procedure. You showed up. You demonstrated. You waited for the mathematics of survival to make the outcome inevitable. The pre-contact civilization calculated the ratio of their force to yours, understood the ratio to be catastrophic, and accepted the terms. 412 times. Now the council was convening mid-procedure because 3 of their frigates had been damaged by pieces of a mountain range they had destroyed themselves, and because their intelligence division had spent the last 6 hours doing a comprehensive review of everything they knew about humanity and discovering, one by one, things they wished they had noticed earlier. Fleet Admiral Saravel stood at the head of the council table on the flagship's upper command deck and delivered the damage report without ceremony, because ceremony at this point would have been insulting to everyone in the room. 3 frigates, structural damage ranging from minor to moderate. 1 frigate with partial drive system failure, currently being assisted by support vessels. No casualties among the crew, which was the one fact that made the report less embarrassing than it could have been. The debris field from the demonstration strike was now largely exhausted as a threat. Earth's orbital platforms had redirected approximately 60% of the useful material before the fleet's repositioning had removed them from optimal redirection angles. So the immediate problem was solved. The larger problem was the implication. They collected the pieces, said Councilmember Dravath, head of intelligence, who was reading from a tablet and looking like someone who had discovered a structural problem in their own house. Every fragment our strike generated. They calculated trajectories in real time, corrected for orbital mechanics, and started redirecting them within 11 minutes of the strike. He set the tablet down. Our best analysis team took 6 hours to figure out what they were doing. They were already doing it. They were expecting the strike, Saravel said. They were expecting a strike. We don't know if they predicted the location or simply prepared for any demonstration event and adapted on contact. Dravath paused, which is, frankly, a more alarming possibility. Silence around the table. Councilmember Preth, Fleet Logistics, leaned forward. What is Phase 2? You mentioned Phase 2 in the report. Saravel looked at him. They said it on an open channel. Preth understood what that meant. He looked slightly ill. They want us to hear it. Everything they've transmitted has been on open channels. Everything. Saravel looked around the table. They're telling us what they're doing before they do it. They told us they were going to use the debris before they used it. They want us to know. Another silence, different in texture from the first one. Why? Said Yeth, who had followed Saravel into the council room because she hadn't told him not to, and he had decided that being present for this particular conversation was worth the breach of protocol. Ask their defense secretary, Saravel said. He told us it was the sporting thing to do. Harold had been briefed on the Hegemony's War Council by the listening stations on the outer orbital platforms, which had been passively collecting Hegemony signals since the fleet arrived and had, in the last 6 hours, gotten much better at parsing them. The signals intelligence team was staffed by people who had spent their careers decoding things, communications analysts, cryptographers, a linguist from a university in Norway who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of problem since she was 8 years old, and had solved the preliminary translation matrix in 40 minutes by treating the hegemony carrier frequency as a kind of tonal Morse, and working backward from there. Her name was Dr. Ingrid Larson. She was 34 years old. She had drunk 11 cups of coffee in the last 6 hours, and she had just walked into Harold's office with a tablet, and a look on her face that was the specific look of someone carrying both very good and very frightening news. They're scared, she said. She sat down without being invited, which Harold respected. Not panicking, not yet. But the council transmission has a stress pattern in the higher frequency ranges that their intelligence files. The ones we pulled from the scout probes they didn't know we'd found indicate correlates with elevated threat assessment. She put the tablet in front of him. They're updating their picture of us. Harold looked at the tablet. Graphs, wave patterns, numbers. He looked at them with the expression of someone who respected data enough to know he should look at it before handing it to someone who understood it. Summary, he said. They didn't expect the rocks. They definitely didn't expect us to turn their demonstration strike into ammunition. And now they're trying to figure out what Phase 2 is. Good. Sir, I want to be clear about what they can actually do to us if they stop being careful. Her voice was even, not frightened, calibrated the way you got calibrated when the fear was too big to hold as an emotion and had to be converted into information instead. 1,700 ships. If they decide to stop the demonstration phase and move to actual engagement, our orbital platforms have maybe 4 hours of combat capability before they're gone. Ground-based defenses, maybe another 6 hours. We are not winning a straight fight. I know, Harold said. So Phase 2 has to work. Phase 2 will work, Harold said, because Phase 2 isn't a fight. He turned the tablet back toward her. He had written something on the screen with his finger in the Notes app. She looked at it. That's not a military strategy, she said. That's a negotiation tactic. Dr. Larson, Harold said, I spent 20 years in a coal county where the main industry was telling big companies that what they wanted from us was going to cost them more than they'd planned. Every time. He leaned back. This is the same conversation. Bigger room. She looked at him for a moment. Then, she looked at the tablet again. You're going to make them think they've already lost something they haven't lost yet. I'm going to make them think, Harold said, about what the math actually is. Because right now, they're running the math they always run, their ships versus our ships, their weapons versus our weapons. And by that math, we lose. Obviously, he stood up. But that's the wrong math. We need them running a different equation. Which equation? He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, which meant he was about to do something in front of a camera. The one where they calculate what it cost them to stay, he said. Phase 2 began at hour 28. It did not begin with weapons. It began with a broadcast. Harold Briggs, in a slightly better press version of his previous clothes, sat in front of the same camera and delivered what was officially logged as a diplomatic communication and what functionally was the most specifically unsettling piece of information management that the Hegemony Intelligence Division had ever been handed. He started with facts. Earth's nuclear arsenal, 12,240 warheads, yield ranging from tactical to city-destroying, distributed across delivery systems including ground-based missiles, submarine-based missiles, aircraft-delivered weapons, and, as of 72 hours ago, a number of orbital platforms that had just been very quietly reclassified. He said this calmly. With sources, the coordinates of 43 launch facilities, which hegemony scans confirmed were accurate. The yield calculations, which hegemony physics could verify. The delivery system ranges, which are what they were. Then, he said the thing that mattered. These weapons cannot hurt your fleet, Harold said. 12,000 nuclear warheads against 1,700 ships. We know. We've run it. You can intercept them. You can absorb the ones that get through. We do not have the numbers to threaten your fleet in any meaningful way, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. He paused. But I want to ask you a different question. Not what do these weapons do to your ships? What do they do to our planet? Silence. He let sit. If your fleet pushes to an orbital engagement, if this becomes a real fight, we cannot stop you from taking this planet. But we can guarantee that what you take is not the planet you came here for. He looked directly at the camera with the expression of someone who had thought about this very carefully and was at peace with it. Every nuclear weapon we have is pre-targeted, not at your ships, at our own resource infrastructure, mining facilities, rare earth deposits, agricultural hubs, the deep water extraction platforms that contain 3 of the largest untouched mineral deposits on this planet. Another pause. You've been watching us for 40 years. You know what's down there. You know what it's worth. He folded his hands on the desk. You can have this planet. But if you push this to a fight, you will have a very large, moderately radioactive rock with about 14 billion angry people on it, and very few of the things you actually came here to get. That's the trade you're making. He stood up. We're not asking you to leave, he said. We're asking you to think about what this costs you. Because right now it's costing you 3 damaged frigates and a mountain range. We can keep adding to that number for a lot longer than you might think. Or we can talk. He picked up his coffee. We're good at talking. We're also good at the other thing. Pick which conversation you want to have. He walked out of frame. The council chamber on the Hegemony flagship went very quiet. Council member Dravath was doing calculations on his tablet. He had been doing them since the broadcast began because he had recognized immediately what Harold was describing and had wanted the numbers in front of him before he had to talk about them. The numbers were not good. The primary value proposition of Earth, in hegemony economic terms, was not the population. Population was useful. Absorbed labor forces contributed to hegemony infrastructure development, but it was not the primary driver. The primary driver was Earth's geological profile. The planet was, by an unusual combination of formation history and tectonic activity, one of the most mineral-dense rocky bodies in this sector of the galaxy. Rare Earth elements, heavy metals, deep-crust deposits of materials that were extraordinarily costly to synthesize and extraordinarily valuable to hegemony technology manufacturing. The absorption protocol cost per planetary operation approximately 2.3 trillion hegemony economic units. That was the cost of sending the fleet, conducting the demonstration, completing the integration, and establishing a compliant governance structure. Against that cost, Earth's geological value represented a return of approximately 40 trillion units over a standard extraction period. If 40% of the surface mineral infrastructure was destroyed, that return dropped below the operation cost. If 60% was destroyed, the operation ran at a significant loss. He knows our analysis, Dravath said. The room looked at him. He knows what this planet is worth to us. He knows the margin. He is threatening to destroy our return on investment. Can he do it? Preth asked. Genuinely. If we push to engagement, can he execute that threat before we neutralize the launch systems? Dravath looked at his calculations. At the 43 verified launch facilities, at the submarine-based systems, which were underwater and therefore harder to track, at the orbital platforms that had just been reclassified. Some of them, he said. Enough of them. Saravel had not spoken during the broadcast. She stood now at the viewport, looking at the planet below. Blue and white and green. Unreasonably beautiful, in the way that high mineral density worlds tended to be, as though the planet's wealth expressed itself aesthetically. He's not fighting us, she said. He's negotiating. With what leverage? Preth said. He can't win. He doesn't need to win. She turned around. He needs to make winning cost more than it's worth. And he may have just done exactly that. Yeth, at the back of the room, thought of the 11 words. Asterisk, you picked the wrong species, friend. Buckle up. We remember everything. Asterisk, he thought about the phrase, sporting thing to do. He thought about a species that had, in 48 hours, redirected a mountain range, published the coordinates of its own launch facilities, and told its enemy exactly what it was going to do before it did it. Not because it was careless, but because the telling was part of the strategy. They wanted the hegemony to see it coming, because seeing it coming and not being able to stop it was worse than being hit. Admiral, Yeth said, I think I understand what buckle up means. Harold was back in his office when the response came. Not from the fleet admiral, from a council member. That was interesting. The move down the chain of command, the signal that this was now a conversation between administrators rather than commanders. Harold filed that away. It meant they were considering the economic argument. The council member's name was Dravath. He looked like someone who balanced very large budgets for a living, which was what he was. He was very polite. Defense Secretary Briggs, Dravath said, we would like to understand your terms. Harold nodded. He had terms. He had had terms since hour one. He talked for 45 minutes. When he was finished, Dravath was quiet for a long moment. You are proposing, Dravath said carefully, a bilateral extraction agreement. Shared access. Negotiated rates. Maintained governance autonomy for Earth under a non-absorption arrangement. I'm proposing, Harold said, a deal where you get what you actually came here for without having to fight us for it, which save you a fleet operation and saves us a planet. It's a good deal. We both walk away better than we came in. He paused. Option B is you push the engagement. We glass 40% of the most valuable geological sites on this rock. And you explain to whoever runs your budget office why a 40 trillion unit return just became a liability. Dravath was silent. We have been doing this for 400 years, he said, finally. There's a protocol. I know, Harold said. And your protocol works great on species that do the math and decide fighting isn't rational. But we're not. He seemed to look for the word. We're not built that way. We know fighting isn't rational. We do anyway. That's not a threat. That's just an accurate description of our history. He looked at Dravath levelly. The deal is better. For both of us. Another silence. I will, Dravath said. Need to consult with the full council. Take your time, Harold said. He meant it. Every hour they were consulting was an hour the orbital teams were running the next phase of contingency planning, and Harold liked contingency planning. He liked having the next list ready. We'll be here. He cut the transmission. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. He picked up his comm and called his granddaughter. Hey, kid, he said. We're still in it. Obviously, she said. He smiled. He set the comm down. Outside, the fleet was still there. 1,700 ships. But 3 of them were damaged, and one of them was having a conversation that was not the conversation it had come here to have, and Harold Briggs, who had spent his life watching large things get convinced to take less than they planned on, thought that was probably progress. He made a note in his file. Phase 2. Successful. Move to Phase 3 when ready. Don't let them think about it too long. Asterisk, he drew a line under it. Below the line, he wrote, Phase 3, remind them what rocks can do. He underlined that one twice. The council deliberated for 9 hours. Harold spent those 9 hours not sleeping, which was becoming something of a habit, and reading intelligence reports about hegemony civilization that the signals team was continuing to pull from intercepted communications with an efficiency that was startling even the people doing it. Dr. Larson had built a translation pipeline that ran continuously now, sorted by priority, flagged for relevance, and delivered to Harold's desk every 40 minutes in a format he had specifically requested. No jargon, no hedging, just what they know, what they think, and what they're afraid of. What they knew: humanity had nuclear weapons, kinetic capability via the debris redirect system, and an unknown quantity of additional preparations that Harold had alluded to in his broadcasts without specifying. What they thought: Harold was bluffing about some of it. Maybe the reclassified orbital platforms. Maybe the targeting presets on the mineral infrastructure. What they were afraid of: that he wasn't bluffing about any of it. Harold read the fear assessment twice. He put down. He picked up the phone and called the orbital platform commander. Those reclassified platforms, he said. Tell me where we actually are. Commander Yuki Hashimoto, who had not slept either and who had the specific focused energy of someone running entirely on adrenaline and professional obligation, told him. The platforms had been retrofitted, as Harold knew, for the rock redirect system. What the hegemony didn't know, and what Harold had been counting on them not knowing, was that the refitting had also increased their energy output capacity significantly, a necessary engineering consequence of a new power draw, which meant that their directed energy systems were now operating at approximately 140% of their original rated capacity. They still couldn't fight 1,700 ships, but they could do considerably more damage on the way out than the hegemony's intelligence file suggested. Good, Harold said. Make sure that's visible on their sensor arrays. Sir, we're not hiding it. Their sensors are good enough to see our output signatures. I know. I want them to see the discrepancy and calculate what it means. A pause. You want them to know we're stronger than their files say. I want them to wonder what else their files got wrong, Harold said. There's a difference. On the flagship, Sub-Admiral Yeth was also reading an intelligence report. His was internal, a review compiled by hegemony analysis teams of everything they had underestimated about Earth. The list was longer than he was comfortable with. The mineral targeting presets, if real, represented a strategic self-denial capability that the hegemony had never encountered before. This was not because other civilizations hadn't had the capacity for it. Plenty of pre-contact species had possessed the ability to destroy their own resource base. It was that no species had credibly threatened to do it. The mathematics of self-preservation always intervened. A species fighting for survival would not voluntarily destroy its own planet's economic value, because the planet was what they were fighting to save, unless they had decided that the planet under foreign control was not, in any meaningful sense, the planet they were fighting to save. Yeth read that conclusion. He read it again. He thought about it for a while. He thought about human history, which the intelligence files contained in significant detail, because 40 years of observation produced significant detail, and which he'd been reading in random fragments for the last several hours because his mind needed something to do while the council deliberated. The history was not reassuring. It was not the wars. Every species had wars, and hegemony military historians had cataloged alien conflicts with dispassionate thoroughness. It was the particular way humans conducted wars. The willingness to continue past the point where any rational actor would have stopped. The specific capacity for sustained commitment in the face of adverse mathematics. Yeth had found a human phrase in the files that had been flagged by an analyst as culturally significant. Asterisk, we will fight them on the beaches. Asterisk, he had found another. Asterisk, I have not yet begun to fight. Asterisk, and another, older, that was apparently attributed to a human military leader who had been trapped behind enemy lines with inadequate supplies and had responded to the situation by attacking nuts. Just that word. Nuts. As a complete response to an ultimatum from a superior force. Yeth was not a linguist, but he had read enough of the files to know that nuts in this context meant something that translated roughly to "we decline your reality and substitute our own." He closed a file. He looked out the viewport at the planet below. He thought about Harold Briggs in his office, not sleeping, making contingency plans. He thought about the rocks. He went to find Admiral Saravel. She was in her private briefing room, alone, with a star chart that covered the whole back wall, and showed this sector of the galaxy in a scale that made individual planets look like dust motes. She had pulled up 4 other systems where hegemony absorptions had occurred in the last 20 years, and was comparing them to Earth. The planet ratios, the mineral profiles, the populations. Yeth stood at the door for a moment before she acknowledged him. "You've been reading human history," she said, without turning around. "How did you know?" "You have the expression." She turned around. "The analysts get it after about 3 hours. A particular kind of," she searched for the word, "unsettledness. Like discovering a calculation error in something you thought was solved." He came in. He stood beside her and looked at the star chart. "They don't stop," he said. "I've been looking at their conflict record. Mathematically hopeless situations, numerically inferior, resource-depleted, strategically encircled, and they don't stop. They degrade, they lose ground, they take catastrophic casualties, and they reorganize and continue. There are engagements in their history that lasted years, past the point where any model we use would predict surrender." "I know," she said. "Do we have a model for that?" She was quiet. "No," she said. "We have models for rational actors. We have models for cornered species with nothing to lose. We have models for ideologically committed forces and for leadership-dependent hierarchies that collapse when you remove key figures." She looked at the star chart. "We don't have a model for a species whose default response to impossible odds is to treat the odds as a starting point for negotiation." Yeth thought about that. He thought about Harold saying no 11 minutes after 1,700 ships arrived. "The debris field," he said, "when they redirected the mountain pieces. That wasn't desperation. That was infrastructure we didn't know existed, used in a way we hadn't considered, executed faster than we expected." He looked at her. "Admiral, how much of what they have did we not document?" She didn't answer. The answer was in her face. "The council deliberation," Yeth said. "Were they actually deciding whether to push to full engagement?" She said it flatly. "There is a faction that believes the threat to mineral infrastructure is a bluff, that Harold Briggs is posturing, that if we demonstrate sufficient force, the calculation will change, and the humans will accept absorption terms." She paused. "They're not wrong that it's possible. What do you think?" She looked at him. She had 39 years more experience than him, and the specific kind of certainty that came from those years. She also had the specific kind of uncertainty that came from reading reports about damage from rocks. "I think," she said, "that the last time I was certain about an outcome, 3 of my ships got hit by a mountain." She turned back to the star chart. "And I think that when a species tells you exactly what they're going to do before they do it, and then does it precisely, you should take the next thing they tell you seriously." She reached out and touched Earth's dot on the star map. "He's not bluffing," she said. "He would do it. He would destroy the mineral deposits. Not because he wants to, because he's decided it's better than the alternative, and he has the specific kind of stubbornness that holds a decision once it's made." She pulled her hand back. "I've seen that expression in 40 years of planetary negotiations. Usually on the face of someone who has already accepted the worst outcome and is now operating from beyond it. Those people don't bluff." Yeth thought about that. "Then, what does the council decide?" he said. "The council decided at hour 37. Harold got the answer not from Dravath this time, but from Fleet Admiral Sarvel herself, which meant it was the final answer, and not a feeler." She looked tired. He didn't know enough about her species to read tiredness accurately, but Something in the set of her shoulders translated. "Defense Secretary Briggs," she said, "the Council has reviewed your proposed framework." "I appreciate that," Harold said. "The non-absorption arrangement you proposed, bilateral extraction access, maintained governance autonomy, negotiated rates with a most favored partner status for hegemony operations, is without precedent in our operational history." "I know," Harold said. "We're aware we're the first." 412 successful absorptions, she said. "In 400 years. There's a weight to that precedent." Harold nodded. He understood precedent. He'd spent years watching companies argue that they couldn't change their practices because they'd never changed them before. He'd watched that argument lose to a sufficiently concrete counteroffer many times. "The precedent is about to cost you 3 damaged frigates and an accounting problem," he said. "Or you said a new one. Your call." She looked at him for a moment that contained approximately 900 years of interstellar civilization's accumulated weight on one side and a coal miner's grandson on the other. "There are conditions," she said. "I'd expect that." They talked for 3 hours. Harold had a team of people behind him, out of frame, passing him notes, trade economists, international lawyers, 3 former heads of state who had flown in from their respective capitals in the last 12 hours, a retired admiral who kept making gestures Harold interpreted as "don't give them that," and who was usually right. Saravel had her counsel, presumably, and Dravath, whose facility with numbers Harold had come to respect across the negotiating distance. It was not a simple conversation. It was the kind of conversation that generates documents and interpretive frameworks and subclauses and the specific category of headache that comes from translating not just language, but fundamental assumptions about property, sovereignty, and what it means for one party to have power over another. But Harold had expected that. Harold had, in fact, been expecting it since hour 1, which was why his team had spent 37 hours preparing for it. At hour 40, they had a framework. Not a treaty. Not yet. A framework. A set of agreed principles on which a treaty could be built, which was a different thing. Shakier, more contingent, requiring follow-through, but it was something that had not existed at hour 0, which was all Harold had set out to achieve. He leaned back in his chair when the connection closed. His team was talking behind him, already processing, already moving into the verification phase, already building the implementation architecture. They were good people. He had not always worked with good people, but these were... He looked at the clock. 41 hours since the fleet arrived. 31 hours left on the original deadline. He picked up his comm. He called his granddaughter again. "How are you doing, kid?" he said. "How are you doing?" she said. She sounded awake. She was 13, and this was, by her estimation, the most interesting thing that had ever happened, and she had been awake since it started. "We got a framework," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means we didn't lose, and we didn't win, and now there's a lot of work to do." "That sounds like something you usually say about negotiating with coal companies." Harold smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Pretty much exactly like that." "Did you sleep?" "No. Grandpa." "Tomorrow," he said. "Probably." He sat in his office and looked at the ceiling for a minute after he hung up. The fleet was still there. 1,700 ships. But the Admiral's posture had shifted in a way that Harold could read across the translator gap. And 3 of those ships were showing damage on their outer hulls, and Hegemony economic advisors were building a cost analysis that Harold had strategically ensured would reach a number that justified the framework he'd proposed. He thought about the mountain range that was gone. He thought about the pieces of it still drifting in the debris field, the parts that hadn't been redirected, slowly dispersing into lower orbits. He thought about what the hegemony hadn't known before today, and what they knew now. He picked up his notepad and wrote at the bottom of the Phase 3 notes. Phase 4. Don't let them forget what it cost to get here. Asterisk, he looked at it. They won't asterisk, he thought. Asterisk, that's the thing about rocks. They leave marks. Asterisk, he closed the notepad. He put his head down on his desk because he was 61 years old and had been awake for 41 hours, and even Harold Briggs had a limit somewhere, and apparently this was it. He was asleep in approximately 90 seconds. Outside, the fleet waited. Inside, the humans planned. This had always been, for as long as humans had existed, the shape of things. The treaty took 11 days. Not 11 hours, not 11 weeks. 11 days of continuous negotiation across a translator gap that Dr. Ingrid Larson and her team maintained around the clock with a dedication that Harold would later describe in the official record as frankly superhuman, which is not a word I use lightly given the context. The translator matrix improved every day. By day 3, it was handling nuance. By day 7, it was managing something approximating subtext. By day 9, Harold and Councilmember Dravath were having conversations that neither of their respective teams needed to parse afterward. Harold did not sleep more than 4 hours a time during those 11 days. This was not strategic. This was simply his nature, the same nature that had kept him in a mines long after his back said stop, long after everyone around him had made peace with the limitations of their situation. Harold Briggs was not built with an off switch, and the 11 days were the kind of work that reached into you and found a part that didn't have one. The framework became a document. The document grew subdocuments. Subdocuments generated technical annexes on extraction protocols, revenue-sharing matrices, sovereignty protection clauses, and a section that Harold had personally insisted on, over 45 minutes of pointed argument with Dravath, which established formal prohibitions on hegemony observation activities within a defined Earth sphere of influence radius. They had been watching us for 40 years, Harold had said. That stops now. Dravath had said that observation activities were standard hegemony practice for monitoring partner civilizations. Harold had said they were welcome to monitor in the agreed zones under the agreed protocols and nowhere else, and if that wasn't acceptable then, they should revisit the clause about what happened to the deep water extraction platforms. Dravath had conceded the point. He was becoming, Harold felt, something that was not exactly an ally, but was a person he could work with, which was most of what Harold asked of the people across the table from him. The hardest part, the part Harold lost 3 nights of sleep specifically over, was the precedent clause. Saravel had raised it in the 7th day's session. Formally, quietly, with the specific care of someone placing something fragile on the table. You understand, she said, that this agreement will be visible to the full hegemony diplomatic record. Other worlds will see it. Other civilizations in early contact phases will become aware that this arrangement exists. She paused. The effect on subsequent absorption operations would be significant. Harold said he understood that. Civilizations that previously accepted absorption terms without resistance will have a reference point, she said. They will know that resistance was, in at least one case, viable. Harold said he understood that too. It destabilizes 400 years of precedent, she said. Harold looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said, it does. He let that sit. I'm not going to pretend that's not true. And I understand that's a cost for you. I understand it's a significant one. He kept looking at her. But I think you already know I'm not going to agree to a secrecy clause on this arrangement. So maybe the question is how we structure the disclosure in a way that works for both of us. She was quiet. You're not worried about other civilizations using this as a template, Saravel said. It was not quite a question. I'm an optimist about humans, Harold said. Cautious about everything else. He leaned forward slightly. Here's what I think. In 412 absorptions, you found 412 civilizations that, for whatever reason, decided the math wasn't in their favor and accepted your terms. You may have a few more of those in your future. But the arrangement with Earth isn't going to be replicable everywhere because the conditions that made it work were specific. He ticked them off. Geological value that created a credible self-denial threat. Pre-existing strategic infrastructure that you hadn't documented. A population with a documented history of irrational persistence that gave the self-denial threat credibility. And he paused, somebody willing to sit at this table long enough to build something. He sat back. Other species may try to copy the strategy. Some of them might make it work. Most won't, because the specific conditions won't be there. He looked at Saravel. And in the meantime, you get something you've never had before, a partner civilization that isn't absorbed, that isn't resentful, that has a material stake in making this arrangement succeed. He paused. We're very good at things we have a material stake in. You've seen some of that this week. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Dravath, at her side, glanced at her. I have read your history, she said finally. We all have, this past week, more carefully than before. She looked at him with something that was not quite respect and not quite wariness and was possibly both simultaneously. You are a species that fought other humans for territory that is now one of your major trade partners. You fought a war that killed tens of millions of your own people over the question of whether some of your people could own other people, and then rebuilt the defeated side into an integral part of your civilization within a generation. She looked at him. You do not hold grudges. We hold grudges, Harold said. We're just also practical. That combination, Saravel said, is rarer than you might think. The treaty was signed on day 11. It was signed in 3 locations simultaneously, on the Hegemony flagship, in the UN building in Geneva, and on the orbital platform that had redirected the mountain pieces because Harold had decided that location mattered and that a ceremony on the platform that had turned a demonstration strike into a negotiating chip was the right symbolic geography for what they were doing. Harold was not on the orbital platform. He was in Geneva because that's where the cameras were, and the cameras mattered, not for Harold, but for the 14 billion people who had spent 11 days not sleeping well and deserving to see the thing at the end of it clearly. He signed the document with a pen. An actual pen. Dravath had asked why through the translator, and Harold had said that some things needed to be done by hand, and Dravath had found this puzzling and then, after a moment, had asked if he could examine the pen afterward. Harold had given it to him. As a gift. A small gesture. The kind of thing you did when you were building something long-term and wanted the other party to have a physical object to put in the story they told about this later. The signing was broadcast everywhere. On Earth, and at Saravel's instruction, which Harold had not expected and would think about for a long time afterward, throughout the Hegemony fleet and to the nearest Hegemony relay stations, which meant it was going to spread through the Hegemony communications network for the next several months until it reached the outer boundaries of their territory. 413. That was the number of contact events. 412 absorptions. One arrangement. Saravel came to the signing ceremony via holographic link. She stood in the projection space in the Geneva chamber and looked at Harold Briggs and the gathered representatives of Earth governments and the document that was now signed, and she said something that was not in the official protocol. Defense Secretary Briggs. Before we conclude, she paused. I have a question that is personal, not official. You are not required to answer. Harold said go ahead. At the beginning, she said, when I asked you to confirm that you understood our terms, you said no in 11 seconds. You had just received confirmation of 1,700 ships in your orbital space. You had no plan yet. I know this because I've read your timeline. You didn't have the debris redirect analysis. You didn't have the economic threat framework. You didn't have any of it. She looked at him. Why did you say no? Harold was quiet for a moment. My granddaughter called me, he said, while I was in the bathroom. She asked if the aliens were real, and I said yes, and she asked if they were friendly, and I said no, and she said, are we going to fight them? And I said yes, and she said, obviously we're going to win though, right? He paused, and I said obviously, automatically, without thinking. He looked at Saravel, and then I thought about it, and yeah, obviously. He shrugged. I didn't know how yet, but obviously. She looked at him. Because you survived worse, she said. Because, Harold said, we always come up with something. We're very bad at accepting that we've run out of ideas. It's a character flaw we have as a species. It's also the only reason we're still here. She absorbed this. That is, she said, either the most confident thing I've heard in 40 years of fleet command or the most irrational. Probably both, Harold said. That's kind of our brand. The fleet left Earth orbit on day 13. They didn't leave empty. 3 survey vessels remained behind under the new bilateral protocols, hegemony geologists with human counterparts assigned, already beginning the joint extraction mapping that would take years to complete. This was in the treaty. Harold had negotiated it specifically, hegemony presence on human terms, with human supervision, generating shared data, and shared revenue, a model that the hegemony legal team had described as unprecedented and that Harold had described as a normal business arrangement, and that Dravath, after some reflection, had described as unexpectedly elegant. Harold watched the main fleet depart on a screen in his office. He had asked not to be in the room where the official observation was happening, the large room with all the other officials and the cameras, because he wanted to see it by himself first. He was not sure why. He was not usually sentimental about things. The fleet was very large and very fast, and within 4 hours it was beyond visual range of any system he could access. The sensor traces fading into background radiation, 1,700 ships becoming a set of diminishing numbers on a tracking display, and then nothing at all. He sat in his office for a little while after. He thought about the mountain range that was gone, a geological feature that had existed for 60 million years, give or take, and that was now a new geological feature that would take another 6 million years to become something unremarkable. His country had not been under that mountain range. Other countries had. He had already had 3 conversations with their respective governments about the treaty framework and the resource rights questions and the fact that the debris redirect had drawn from the vaporized mass of those mountains, and therefore all the nations whose borders touched the resulting crater had a standing interest in the extraction revenue structure. Those conversations had been complicated. They were going to remain complicated. This was also, Harold thought, very on brand. He picked up his comm. He called his granddaughter. "It's done," he said. She was quiet for a second in the way that 13-year-olds were quiet when something large was landing. "Like done. The fleet is gone. We have a treaty. The survey teams are starting work." He looked out his window at a sky that looked, from this angle, exactly like it always had. "Yeah, done. Are we, famous now? Is this going to be a big thing in space?" Harold thought about that. He thought about 412 absorptions and 1 arrangement and the hegemony communications network carrying the signed treaty toward its outer edges right now, carrying it to civilizations that the hegemony had already absorbed or was in the process of approaching or was planning to approach someday, and what it would mean when it got there. "We might be," he said. "Yeah, we might be a pretty big thing. Because of the rocks?" "Because of the rocks," he said, "and because we said no and figured out the rest later." A pause. "That's kind of what you always do," she said. He smiled. He hadn't known she'd noticed that. "Yeah," he said, "it is." 6 months later, the hegemony published the contact report. It was standard practice. Every contact event was logged in the central record, available to member civilizations and partner entities. The Earth Contact Report was supposed to be routine. 3 pages. Contact date, civilization profile, absorption outcome or arrangement type, strategic notes for future operations. The Earth Report was 47 pages. The strategic notes section alone was 19 pages. It covered the debris redirect operation, the mineral self-denial framework, the nuclear credibility dynamic, and the negotiation approach Harold had employed. It covered the speed of human adaptation, 11 minutes from demonstration strike to kinetic response. It covered the translation capability that had been developed without hegemony assistance. It covered the economic leverage analysis that Harold had clearly prepared before the fleet arrived. At the end of the strategic notes section, the report's author, Council Member Dravath, as it turned out, had included a single paragraph that was not analysis. It was as close as hegemony diplomatic language could manage, something like a warning. He had translated it carefully with Dr. Larson's help because it was going to be quoted. He had made sure the translation was right. This contact event represents a deviation from established operational parameters across every assessed dimension. Standard absorption framework assumptions, rational actor behavior under adverse odds, predictable self-preservation calculus, information asymmetry favoring hegemony preparedness were not applicable. Earth civilization demonstrates a capacity for adaptive non-rational persistence combined with strategic improvisation that no existing model adequately captures. Future contact operations with this civilization, and with civilizations that may have received information about this contact event, should be approached with revised assumptions. The key revised assumption is this: do not calculate what a human will do. Calculate what they will do when the calculation says it's impossible. Assume they have already thought of something you have not. Asterisk, the last line was added in a footnote, which was unusual for official hegemony reports. Dravath had apparently added it himself, after the main document was submitted as an addendum that the Records Office had flagged as out of protocol, and then included anyway, because nobody could identify a regulation it specifically violated. The footnote said, asterisk, they threw a mountain at us. Think about what they will throw next. Asterisk, Harold, read the report. Dr. Larson had sent it to him with a note that said, you should see this, and a second note a few hours later that said, I may need to sleep for several days, and a third note that said, also, the Geological Survey team found something in the South Atlantic deep water site that Dravath is going to call you about, and I think you're going to like it. He read the footnote twice. He thought about Dravath on day 7, examining the pen, turning it over in whatever the hegemony equivalent of hands was, looking at the thing that had left a mark on the document. They threw a mountain at us. Think about what they will throw next. Harold picked up his pen. He opened his notepad. On a new page at the top, he wrote, Phase 5. He sat there for a moment, looking at it. Below it, he wrote, make sure they never forget we're still here. He underlined it. He thought about it some more. He added a word. Make sure they never forget we're still here. And, thinking, asterisk, he closed the notepad. Outside his window, the sky was the same sky it had always been, blue and ordinary and full of things that were very far away, and now knew with certainty that this small wet rock at the edge of an unremarkable solar system was not, in any way that mattered, small. The mountain was gone. The people were still there. They'd already thought of something else. They always had.